Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Ciara Brennan, and I'm the Director of the Environmental Justice Network Ireland, EJNI. And I'd just like to welcome everybody to this webinar today on Ireland's National Long-Term Strategy. This is a session that is co-hosted by EJNI and Community Law and Mediation, CLM. And the purpose of the webinar today is to help individuals and organisations with responding to the public consultation on Ireland's National Long-Term Strategy, and also to flag that the deadline for responding to that is public consultation is Friday the 30th of June. EJNI and CLM will also be shortly publishing a briefing paper which will be circulated over the next couple of days and will be available on both the EJNI and CLM websites. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers today. Clodagh Daly, who's the manager at CLM Centre for Environmental Justice, and Orla Kelleher, who's a lecturer at Maynooth University and who's doing some research with EJNI this semester. So we may not use the full hour for this session, but please feel free to add any questions into the chat and we'll respond to those after we hear from Clodagh and Orla. Thank you very much, and I'll hand over directly to Clodagh. Thanks.
Thanks, Ciara. Okay, I'll just share my screen.
Actually, Clodagh, I might hop in first if that's okay.
That's actually, yeah, I think that kind of sets the framework. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah,
great. Thanks for that.
Okay, so bear with me for one moment while I get my slides going. So, hi everybody. It's really lovely to be here this morning. So what we're going to do for the next kind of 20 minutes, half hour is go through some of the kind of key points from the briefing paper that Clodagh and I have been preparing. As Ciara mentioned, it's something we'll share with everybody afterwards, and we hope that it will be useful for people in preparing for the public consultation on the long-term strategy. So what I am going to do for my 10-15 minutes is do a quick run through, I suppose, of what the long-term strategy is all about. Why is it important? Why should we care about this? Why should we be responding to this public consultation? Look at sort of some of the legal requirements for the long-term strategy, so both under Irish law, but also under European law, and then look at what we've kind of identified to be some gaps and to talk about those in the hope that we might start a discussion for how, I suppose, how to proceed with this long-term strategy and what we'd like to see changed when the government finalises the long-term strategy. So I suppose just to kind of start out, again, apologies, this might be really, really obvious to some people, but just so we're all on the one page, when we're talking about a long-term strategy, we're talking about a decarbonisation plan for a society. So how are we going to decarbonise our society over the next 30 years? So it's meant to really be this roadmap out to 2050, setting out in detail, and I think that's the really important point here is the level of detail. So it's meant to set out in detail how the state is planning to achieve its 2050 target, and in Ireland for now that target is net zero by 2050 at the latest. So I will come back and talk a bit about that decarbonisation date and why we think that that is actually far too late, to be honest, but why the long-term strategy is a big opportunity to look at that again. So this idea of a long-term strategy, it was envisaged under the Paris Agreement itself. So the Paris Agreement refers to this idea of a long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategy. So it is a feature of international climate law, but there are also concrete legal requirements under Irish climate law, but also under the EU governance regulation about what we should expect to see in the long-term strategy. So with that, I think I will move on to talking a little bit about why we think the long-term strategy is so important, and I suppose justifying why people should go to the effort of trying to make a submission to the public consultation. So I think, like all climate plans that look at either the next 10 years, so things like the National Energy and Climate Plan, so the 2030 plans, but also the long-term strategies. Any long-term climate plan really has kind of some shared benefits, I suppose. So one thing is the idea that it can increase transparency about planned climate measures. It's a way of, I suppose, getting government to set out what they're actually planning, so we have a good idea about, you know, the strength of those measures. Do we approve of them? Do we think we need more? It's an opportunity really for us to see what the government is planning. Because the long-term strategy is this sort of iterative process where it's being updated, has to be updated every 10 years, but there's a facility where necessary for it to be updated every 5 years. It's an opportunity each time we have this revision to increase the level of ambition. So what we think that the long-term strategy should be doing is being used as an opportunity to increase the level of ambition that the government has committed to. I think probably one of the most important features of a long-term strategy is that it allows us to align policies today with this long-term trajectory out to net zero by 2050. And in doing so, it's a way of preventing, I suppose, us becoming locked into high emissions activities or fossil fuel infrastructure. So if you develop a really good long-term strategy, which sets out a really clear trajectory to how you're going to decarbonize your society, that helps you prevent short-term policy decisions that might otherwise lock us into high emissions activities. So it's a way of circumventing that short-term, those sort of short-term decisions that might not really be compatible with our long-term target. I think also the level of detail you find in a long-term strategy is a very useful indicator for how seriously a government is taking climate change, the level of political commitment that is behind the transition. So the more detailed the plan, the more ambitious the plan, the better we can see the level of commitment. Also, they're very useful for comparing how different countries, so particularly EU member states, because all EU member states have to complete these long-term strategies. So how committed they are to actually climate mitigation and the level of ambition. And I think it can be a really useful exercise in learning between what member states are doing. And then finally, where if the long-term strategy is not particularly good, or if a state is not sticking to what they've committed to in their long-term strategy, it's a way of ensuring accountability. So the European Commission has a very important oversight role with the long-term strategy. So the Commission has to be able to assess all of the long-term strategies to see if they're adequate to achieving the EU's collective goal of net zero by 2050 at the latest. So there's a an avenue there for accountability on the Commission's part, but also at a level of NGOs and individuals. They're a way of holding governments to account to their climate commitments. So what's being committed to in there is sort of the yardstick really for whether or not a government is delivering. So I've kind of started to touch on some of these requirements already. I won't try bore everyone with every little detail about what the legal requirements are, but what I want to do instead is to sort of pull out a few key obligations, both under EU climate law, but also under Irish climate law. There's some overlapping obligations, and then there are some obligations that are unique, particularly to the Irish Climate Act. And I think they have a huge amount of potential in terms of driving higher ambition within the long-term strategy. So firstly, under the EU governance regulations, so touched on this a little bit before, but it requires two types of plans. So these long-term strategies, but also the NECPs, the National Energy and Climate Plan. So the NECPs are these 2030 plans, and the long-term strategies are effectively 2050 plans. So the long-term strategies have to be produced by member states every 10 years. There is this requirement to update them where necessary every 5 years, and that's basically the process we're in now, is this updating process with the long-term strategy. Now, most member states are just updating in the Irish context because we still haven't produced a long-term strategy. It's our sort of first go at producing a long-term strategy. Was delayed by government to I suppose take account of the new Climate Act. So the requirement under EU law was that the long-term strategies were meant to be submitted to the Commission by the 1st of January 2020. They say Ireland is 3 years overdue now in producing its long-term strategy, and what we have now is the government's sort of first effort at producing a long-term strategy. So under the governance regulation, there's requirements about what should be in it, and there's sort of an indicated template for what your long-term strategy should look like. So it should include total greenhouse gas emission reductions and removals. It should have a breakdown for individual sectors of the emission reductions planned and the level of sinks required, the expected progress to meeting the target, the expected socio-economic impacts of the transition, and then links to other long-term objectives, and importantly, investments. So where's the money going to actually come from to support the transition? So some of these obligations do overlap with what's required under the Irish Climate Act. So we have similar provisions under the Irish Climate Act, but we do have some other interesting ones which I think are worth flagging, especially because it seems to be the intention of government to produce one document to satisfy the requirements of both EU climate law and under the Irish Climate Act. So under the Irish Climate Act, we have to produce a long-term climate action strategy as well. So an interesting kind of legal requirement is that the long-term strategy has to specify how the government proposes to achieve the national climate objective. Broadly speaking, the national climate objective is a net zero target by 2050 at the latest. So this provision has featured in the Irish climate law since its inception. It was what you might describe as the winning provision in Climate Case Ireland. So when the Irish Supreme Court quashed the then National Mitigation Plan, and the National Mitigation Plan has effectively been replaced by this long-term strategy, it did so on the basis of this particular provision. And what it said about the requirements of this provision and the test it set out for what is a compliant climate plan is that a reasonable and interested member of the public should be able to know enough about how the government is intending to achieve its 2050 target from reading the strategy to decide if the policies are effective and appropriate. So it's a useful yardstick, I think, for assessing the content of the plan. Can reasonable and interested members of the public engage with the plan and understand what government is planning? And I think a new innovation of the 2021 amendments to the Climate Act, which are useful, I think, to think about, particularly in terms of the level of ambition we're pursuing within the long-term strategy, is this requirement on both the minister but also government when they're performing their functions here to do so in a manner compatible with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, overarching objectives. So obviously that's the temperature goal, but it's also those climate justice requirements of equity, of common but differentiated responsibility. So that has yet to be teased out in terms of what it requires, but a potentially quite far-reaching obligation. So what do we think of the long-term strategy as it's being produced? Well, I think firstly, it's a huge opportunity, I think, for Ireland to bring forward its decarbonisation date. So we would be calling for government to use the long-term strategy as an opportunity to bring forward its decarbonisation date to 2035. This will be in line with other ambitious member states. For example, in Finland, they have set a decarbonisation date of 2035. So I think at present, Ireland's Ireland's decarbonisation date is not ambitious enough. So I think the long-term strategy is a really useful opportunity to kind of ramp up ambition and show that the government is very serious about making a fair share contribution to the EU's net zero temperature goal, especially because that temperature goal or that decarbonisation goal, because that decarbonisation goal, it's for all member states. So it implies that richer states like Ireland should be reaching net zero much sooner than 2050. And so I think a kind of a good faith engagement, but with that requirement under EU law, but also under the Paris Agreement, that temperature goal would imply reaching decarbonisation sooner. And the other thing we're calling for the government to do as part of the long-term strategy is to be a lot clearer about how that target, that net zero target, is going to be achieved. Is it going to be through emission reductions, or is it going to be through removals? And we think so far as the long-term strategy is being produced, there's not enough detail about how much of the target is going to be coming from emission reductions outright, as opposed to removals from both natural removals but also technology. So what we're calling for is a minimum target for how much of the emission reduction should be coming from emission reductions rather than removals. And I think it's interesting to note that even in the last week, the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change has been calling on the EU in setting a 2040 target for it to reduce emissions by 95% by 2040 relative to 1990 levels. And that's for the EU bloc as a whole. So that's not that differentiation between richer and poorer member states. So I think the long-term strategy, as we see it, is a really important opportunity for a commitment to the majority of emission reductions coming from concrete emission reductions rather than removals. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Clodagh, and I'm really happy to take any questions that people might have towards the end.
Thanks, Orla. That was such a helpful overview of the whole long-term strategy governance. So thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen now. See if this, great. So the way Orla and I worked on our submission to the long-term climate action strategy, which we will circulate online and directly with organizations so that anyone can use it as a basis for their own submission if they'd like to make one. We'd really encourage as many people as possible to participate in this consultation. The way we did it was we first of all looked at those big governance questions that Orla has covered, and then we looked at some of the sectors and what we would like to see the government actually deliver in terms of specific policies in the long-term climate action strategy. So the ones that we focused on are phasing out fossil fuels, delivering housing and climate justice, delivering transport justice, and then finally delivering a just transition. So the first in relation to phasing out fossil fuel importation and production is really, really key. I suppose the litmus test for any government's long-term climate action strategy is the commitment to phase out fossil fuels. As we know, fossil fuels are the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions globally and the primary contributor to climate change. And in Ireland, fossil fuel emissions account for 57% of Ireland's overall emissions profile. So they represent really the lion's share of Ireland's emissions. So our fossil fuel emissions they kind of sit across electricity, transport, residential and commercial sectors. And they account for a very small proportion of agricultural emissions, about 3% of agricultural emissions. The Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland have called for a timeline and a plan for fossil fuel phase out to urgently be put in place if we are to reach net zero. The strategy, however, doesn't provide any phase out date for the importation or production of fossil fuels. It also actually notes the need to define the future of the gas grid, and it makes references on a few occasions to zero emissions gas like biomethane and biogas. From our perspective, there is a risk that continued reliance on and expansion of Ireland's gas network will just delay the transition and potentially create a carbon lock-in effect. This kind of has further impacts beyond emissions. In relation to our energy security, the strategy mentions the consideration of gas importation infrastructure and LNG, but there is no energy security without climate security. So any planned energy infrastructure needs to align with Ireland's obligations under the Climate Act. And there are actually energy poverty considerations to take into account here as well. The International Energy Agency defines energy security as the uninterrupted availability of energy sources at an available price. But increased fossil gas prices have actually been the primary cause behind higher electricity prices, which have driven the cost of living crisis. So any new fossil fuel infrastructure could just lock households into high electricity and energy prices for decades to come. This has even been noted by Ireland's Climate Change Advisory Council, who called for an expansion of Ireland's renewable energy, which would bring significant reduction in fuel costs. We would really support that, but we'd also note that while pursuing renewable energy sources is absolutely essential, it's really critical that the strategy itself abides by the energy efficiency first principle, because we know that the cleanest unit of energy is the one that isn't used. And so with that in mind, the prioritization of energy to meet the needs of commercial and industrial sectors really needs to be reviewed. And it's not really clear in the strategy how the development of data centres in particular will align with the carbon budget programme or with the overall national transition objective, which is to get to net zero. So EirGrid, for example, has warned that data centres could account for 70% of Ireland's electricity demand by 2030. They already account for 14% of electricity demand, while all rural households count for 12% collectively. An analysis from UCC's Marais Research Centre shows that if we were to impose a moratorium on data centres, it would be the most meaningful and impactful action the government could take to actually reduce demand for fossil fuels. So the strategy needs to be revised to show and to detail, as Orla mentioned, to kind of give that specificity as to how Ireland's energy system will be transitioned in a way that's fast and fair, and that provides energy security and delivers public value along with social and ecological benefit. We're also calling for fossil fuel subsidies to be phased out while ensuring that adequate access to reliable and affordable and clean energy is provided to all, because we know that a lot of people are experiencing energy poverty, but really public financing needs to address that while phasing out fossil fuels. So yeah, and those are just a headline of our core recommendations there. We're calling for fossil fuels to be phased out by 2035, to pass the liquefied natural gas bill into law, and to also end current licenses for fossil fuel exploration, in addition to those others that I've discussed. So the second is in relation to the built environment. This is one that's so important for CLM, and I know that some of my housing colleagues have joined us this morning. It's probably the biggest issue that presents to our organisation overall in terms of our legal advice clinics. The built environment is probably one of the biggest challenges for this government, but we don't really consider that it's been adequately addressed in Ireland's long-term climate action strategy. So, for example, the Irish Green Building Council have found that the construction and built environment sector account for 37% of Ireland's carbon emissions. That's actually the same proportion as agriculture. But delivering on Ireland's housing commitments is really essential to a just transition. As I've noted here, those without adequate housing and shelter are disproportionately impacted by climate change and by other environmental harms, despite having contributed least to the problem. Around 350 kilometres of land in Ireland is vulnerable to flooding if sea levels rise by 1 metre, and then that increases to an area of land of 600 kilometres that's vulnerable under a sea level rise scenario of 3 metres. And in general, the erosion of Ireland's soft coastline means that over time, a significant number of people may be displaced and forced to move inland. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Housing has highlighted that climate action actually presents an opportunity to improve housing systems and policies and legislation to ensure adequate housing for all. And this finding was echoed by the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change last year, which reported with high confidence that unmet needs for housing and infrastructure are a global opportunity to integrate inclusive adaptation strategies into development. So in terms of the kind of solutions that we would like to see, we'd really like to see vacant and derelict properties and sites addressed. There's an issue where in towns across Ireland, and it's very visible to most of us, there is a huge proportion of vacant and derelict sites, and actually within commercial buildings in towns, there's an 80% vacancy percentage or proportion on second level floors of commercial buildings. And the issue with that is not only that those buildings are sitting empty while people can't access housing, there's also a climate angle that needs to be taken into account, because when one-off housing is then being developed outside of urban areas because it's more affordable, we're then locking in transport emissions with people driving to and from urban centres home. So we'd like to see vacancy and derelict properties addressed. We would like all social housing to be retrofitted to a minimum B2 BER this decade. The current national retrofit plan only provides for retrofitting about 20% of Ireland's social housing stock this decade. And that's not really in alignment with what a just transition requires and reaching the furthest behind first. We'd like to see our entire social housing stock retrofitted this decade. We'd like to see in general retrofit ambition increased. So some examples of this are, we would like to see the fully funded energy upgrade retrofit scheme expanded to ensure that all low-income households in low energy efficiency homes are eligible regardless of their home ownership status. And this should include those who are recipients of HAP on the condition of a long-term lease being offered. So this would be a step towards addressing that split incentives issue between landlords and tenants. And it would also hopefully present renovictions by ensuring that those loans are contingent upon a long-term lease. We would also like to see community awareness of retrofit opportunities increased. So this would be where a well-resourced energy advice officer is positioned within each local authority, and they can provide a local and tailored service to support people in accessing the financial advice they need and to understand how they can install kind of quick win measures and to apply for appropriate retrofitting grants. Friends of the Earth have been doing a huge amount of work on this, and last week we also signed a joint statement alongside Friends of the Earth and many others calling for a really much more ambitious and broadened approach to retrofitting. So we can share that as well afterwards if that's of interest. And then finally, we'd like to see the end of fossil fuel boilers installed in homes. It's only likely to lock households into high energy prices for years and years to come. The third sector that we looked at is transport justice. So transport is actually the primary driver of fossil fuel carbon emissions in Ireland and accounted for 34% of energy-related emissions in 2021. But in particular, aviation represents a really growing proportion of Ireland's transport emissions. And some of us may have seen in the headlines recently that between the last quarter of 2021 and 2022, Ireland's emissions increased by over 2 million tonnes, and 75% of those were attributable to aviation. But emissions from aviation and shipping remain excluded from our carbon budget regime and from the long-term climate action strategy. This is a huge oversight. Emissions from the aviation and shipping sectors are very clearly included within the scope of the Paris Agreement. And so the mitigation of these sectors needs to be fully and transparently incorporated into the carbon budget programme and into Ireland's long-term climate action strategy, because we can't say that we have achieved complete decarbonisation or even net zero of all of our economy and society if emissions from aviation and shipping are just entirely excluded. And equally, our 2030 target cannot be met by the exclusion of those industries. And if we think, if all parties to the Paris Agreement were to only focus on reducing and balancing emissions from all sectors of the economy, but excluded aviation and shipping, global decarbonisation would never be achieved. And the inclusion of aviation and shipping emissions within the long-term strategy is also essential to a just transition. Only about 1% of the global population is responsible for 50% of emissions from commercial aviation. And while we don't have comparable data in Ireland, in the UK, for example, we know that 70% of flights are taken by only 15% of the population. So some of the other kind of key recommendations that we have, in addition to the inclusion of aviation and shipping, are investment in local link services to provide affordable and actually reliable public transport across the country, and that's frequent as well. We'd like to see public transport as disability inclusive, and we'd like to see really comprehensive consultation and inclusion with those groups when public transport policy is being developed. We'd like to see a phase out of CO2 emitting cars and commercial vehicles prior to 2035. We would like to see corporations mandated to reduce their air travel emissions by 50% by 2030, and to include a provision to outlaw private jets and domestic flights, as France have recently done. We'd also like to see local authorities empowered to create low emission zones to improve air quality in our urban areas, in addition to those climate benefits as well. And then finally, we would like to see, of course, a just transition. So as Orla mentioned, the EU regulation that requires member states to produce a long-term climate action strategy requires them to include the expected socioeconomic effect of decarbonisation measures. And according to the European Trade Union Confederation, the socioeconomic consequences of the transition have not been adequately addressed or dealt with. And they've highlighted that climate policies will more often than not have strong regressive distributional effects and affect proportionally more low and middle income households. This is kind of worsened by the fact that the general experience and perception of transition in Ireland has not been positive so far. The demands that have been made to workers in some scenarios has not been matched by requisite support to kind of back up and actually support the implementation of those demands. And in Ireland, for example, power generation industries were in the past considered hugely significant sources of pride. And it's been highlighted that regions most impacted by just transition were net contributors to the state until suddenly they were forced to become reliant on subsidies or social welfare transfers. So a lot of trust building is really imperative here. And we know the transition won't be quick. Long-term and secure and sustainable funding is really, really essential. The state is already receiving very substantial funding from the EU for just transition, so it's imperative that the state is accountable in the management of those funds and showing how those funds will be used to guarantee that the resources are provided to those who are actually most in need of assistance. And this will also include coordination of policy across economic, environmental, social, education and labour sectors as well. And a just transition plan needs to be coupled with reactive and supportive policy across government, regional and local levels as well. So these are then the key kind of highlights that we have for our just transition sector. So the first is to identify and detail the social challenges that are expected from the implementation of the long-term strategy, and then detail what resources and measures will be necessary to address them. To include a proper just transition strategy within and across all sectors of the economy, including transport, including aviation and shipping, for example. And then finally, to accelerate the establishment of a Just Transition Commission. This has been long promised, and this has been advocated for by a very wide coalition of civil society and unions, and it hasn't been delivered yet. We are almost, it's halfway through 2023. We are well into the transition, it's well underway. And so the Just Transition Commission is an expert body that absolutely needs to be established as a matter of urgency. So I am going to wrap up there. I am also very happy to take questions and stop sharing now. And as Orla said, we will be sharing our draft submission to the consultation in the next day or two. And we hope that as many people as possible have capacity to participate in the consultation. It's really, really important. So if anyone has questions for myself or Orla, if you'd like to pop them in the Q&A or the chat box, that would be great. Okay, there's one question coming in. Okay, thanks, Teresa. It's very kind. Okay, well, if there are no questions, I suppose we'll wrap up. But just to say thank you so much to everyone for tuning in this morning. Thanks to EJ and I for collaborating. Oh, I just see there might be a question here. How can we avoid large companies offsetting their emissions under their ESG? Orla, do you have thoughts on how we can avoid companies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I suppose in some ways it's useful